as the European Union is developing its genuine European energy policy, it is also, I think, necessary to reflect on what energy mix best represents the interest of the citizens. And it is clear that with everything what is happening now in Japan, this is of an utmost importance for the choices we shall make on this energy mix. We have to accept, and we see now, that security of nuclear energy is essential. Also that apparently a risk-free nuclear energy is not of this world. We know also that real stress tests for the nuclear power plants are important, but maybe it teaches us also another important lesson, and that is that in some parts of the world, in seismically active zones, that it is difficult to consider them as suitable for nuclear power plants. So this hearing, I hope, will put a number of questions and search for a number of first answers. And there are certainly a number of questions that can be raised. What does this nuclear catastrophe mean for the European Union energy policy? And what are safety standards for the nuclear energy of the future? And what role should nuclear energy play in the so-called EU energy mix? There are only a few questions. I'm certain that a number of other questions shall appear, but I give immediately the floor to Lena Eck, who is coordinator in our group for these policies, and she shall share this hearing in which we have a number of important guests, also Mr. Oettinger, who is coming later, the Commissioner responsible for this item. So, Lena, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Guy, and welcome to this hearing to give a bit more in-depth information about what is happening and how we could see the information and facts from the Japanese disasters. Now, we have a very distinguished panel. First of all, we have the latest information from the International Atomic Energy Agency, and then we have Mr. John Lodge, who's been everywhere where anything happened, it seems like, with nuclear. And then we have Mr. Yuri Andreev, a very distinguished former senior engineer of Chernobyl, and who's been decorated a number of times by many states for his knowledge and what he did in Chernobyl. And we have an intervention also from a colleague of his, Mr. Valery Makarenko, who is also with us. And the Commissioner will be here. And lastly, there will be a short question and answer session. Also, we will have the views from the President of the European Parliament Delegation for Relations with Japan, Mr. Hans van Baalen, who's also here with us. So without further ado, I will now start, and we will have this video message from IAEA.
Mr. Chairman, this special meeting of the IAEA Board of Governors is taking place because of the serious accident which occurred at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in Japan on Friday, March 11th, 2011, after a huge earthquake and tsunami. The crisis has still not been resolved, and the situation at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant remains very serious. In addition, high levels of contamination have been measured in the locality of the plant. Last Thursday, I flew to Tokyo for high-level consultations on how best the agency can help. During my visit, the agency's on-the-ground support to Japan became operational. It consists of three main elements. First, a senior agency official has been deployed in Japan to coordinate our assistance activities. Second, the Japanese authorities agreed to the designation of 2 IAEA liaison officers now in place who are working closely with NISA 24 hours per day. Third, the agency's radiation monitoring team has begun sending back measurements to Vienna, including from locations close to the Fukushima site. Additional staff will fly out from Vienna shortly to strengthen the team. Since the accident, I have tried to address some widespread misconceptions in the media about the IAEA's role in nuclear safety. These misunderstandings fueled some criticism of the agency's response, which was not always justified. I explained that we are not a nuclear safety watchdog and that responsibility for nuclear safety lies with our member states. The IAEA acts as a hub for international cooperation, helping to establish safety standards and providing expert advice on best practice. But in contrast to the agency's role in nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear safety measures are applied voluntarily by each individual country, and their role is supportive. Mr. Chairman, since this crisis began, the IAEA, as you would expect, has worked closely with our major international partners. I have been in close contact with United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to ensure effective coordination among different organizations. I have also consulted with WHO Director General Margaret Chan and with the Secretary General of the World Meteorological Organization. Day-to-day contacts continue at the working level with all relevant organizations. A specialist from WMO joined our team in the Incident and Emergency Center, and we are deploying the in-house expertise on radiation contamination of foodstuffs provided by the FAO IAEA Joint Division. I am grateful to the Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, TBOTOT, for promptly granting our request for access to data from its radionuclide monitoring stations. Mr. Chairman, at this stage, the priority remains stabilizing the nuclear reactors and restoring safety. The fifth review meeting of the contracting parties to the Convention on Nuclear Safety next month will provide a first formal opportunity to consider lessons learned. But I believe one lesson is already clear. The current international emergency response framework needs to be reassessed. It was designed largely in the wake of the Chernobyl disaster in 1986, before the information revolution. It reflects the reality of the 1980s, not of the 21st century. The speed at which information now travels and the huge volume of information in public circulation are among the most significant changes since then. Live television and the internet provide constant updates on a crisis situation, not always accurately, to a global audience. The responsibility of the IAEA is to provide authoritative and validated information as quickly as possible, but doing this under the current arrangement inevitably takes time and has limitations. Nuclear power will remain an important and viable option for many countries as a stable and clean source of energy. Some countries are reviewing their plans in the light of Fukushima. The agency's role in nuclear safety may need to be re-examined along with the role of our safety standards. It is already clear that arrangements for putting international nuclear experts in touch with each other quickly during a crisis need to be improved. As I said, the most important thing right now is to restore the safety of the affected reactors. Lessons will need to be learned, and the IAEA is where that discussion should take place. A thorough review of the accident will be necessary, in which peer review will have an important role to play. Mr. Chairman, I reiterate the situation at Fukushima remains serious, but we are starting to see some positive developments. The emergency teams at the site have never lost hope and have not given up. Neither has the IAEA. The agency will continue to do everything in its power to help Japan to overcome the Fukushima crisis and deal effectively with the aftermath. I ask the board for its continuing support. Thank you.
This was the Director General of the IAEA, Yukiya Amano, addressing the ambassadors of the participating countries. And I think it's interesting to see the way they communicate on safety and what happened. So that's why I think, I guess there will be also discussion about the agency and the role of the agency in the aftermath of these tragic events. Now, to get information and understand what really happened, we all have views back and forth, pro and cons, on nuclear and on what happened. But I think it's really important to base the discussion on knowledge and information. And that's why we're very happy to have John Large here, who's been an advisor to a number of governments and also lately to Greenpeace, and been at all the sites, including the atomic submarine Kursk, I heard. So I would give you the floor and the microphone, like this. And please.
Okay, parliamentarians, good morning. I am John Large, a chartered consultant engineer, a fellow of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, graduate member of the Institution of Civil Engineers, and a member of the Institution of Nuclear Institution and a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts. Previously, from the 1960s through to the late 1980s, I was a member of the academic research and teaching staff at Brunel University, where I undertook postgraduate research on behalf of the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority. From the late 1980s, I've been Chief Executive of the Consultant Engineers Large & Associates, specialising in nuclear systems analysis and particularly assessment of the failure of engineered systems. In this role, I've headed up the team of nuclear and weapons experts tasked to assess the nuclear risks and hazards throughout the salvage of the Russian Federation nuclear-powered submarine Kursk. I've personally given evidence to the United Kingdom, Italian, French, United States, New Zealand, South Africa, and now this Parliament, and other government authorities on nuclear matters. And I am presently undertaking a detailed assessment of the recent and ongoing incidents at the Fukushima nuclear plant. Relating to my intervention here today, I have visited and reported upon the very severe accident and radiological consequences arising from Chernobyl, number 4 nuclear power plant. I've been involved firsthand in the aftermath of other serious radiological situations in the former Soviet Union, with nuclear-powered and armed submarines on the Kola Peninsula, and in the Soviet military-industrial plants of Tomsk, Sverdlovsk, and elsewhere in the former Soviet republics and territories. Of course, because not all radiological incidents and accidents are confined to the former Soviets, my experience includes involvement with a year-long repairs to the Royal Navy nuclear-powered submarine HMS Tireless when stranded in Gibraltar with a severe reactor defect, an assessment of the number of radiological situations in the United Kingdom, and for an international organisation, analysis of the fissile production programmes in the Middle East, including separate assessments of the Iraqi to-wafer complex that was devastated by Allied action during the Second Gulf War. Now I turn to recent events at Fukushima, and I will show as a background some slides which may or may not coincide with what I'm saying. So if you'll just bear with those, they may prompt you for some questions afterwards. So if you could click, I'm looking for someone there, click to start it, and it will just roll on irrespective of what I say. We've all been kept abreast of the developing situation at Fukushima on a daily and hourly basis by what might best be described as a feeding frenzy by the media and press. Some of this reporting has been grossly misleading, and I'm not quite sure about that. So, yeah. Some of this reporting has been grossly misleading. Some expert opinion broadcast has been unqualified and downright incorrect. The Japanese government has been confused and taciturn in its management and release of factual information. and the rapid and reliable information exchange has been beset with language and to some extent cultural differences. What we do know is that a series of radiological situations have developed and persist at the Fukushima No. 1 nuclear complex. Two distinctive abnormal events have occurred. Firstly, triggered by the seismic trips, all three operating reactors shut down automatically, but thereafter denied means of cooling. The fuel cores have entered a progressive melt situation, which in turn has resulted in violent explosions. For the first and third of these reactors, the explosion resulted in very substantial damage to the higher reactor servicing areas, including the fuel ponds holding the spent and highly radioactive fuel, and rendering continuing surety of the reactor containment somewhat doubtful. The radioactive discharges from the third reactor are of particular concern because, unlike the other reactor plants, it was particularly fueled with plutonium-based oxide fuel, mixed oxide fuel. The second reactor sustained and apparently contained an internal explosion, but now, like the other two reactor blocks, it seems to be expelling radioactivity to the atmosphere. Secondly, the fourth explosion related not to the reactor, but to the spent fuel storage pond housed in the reactor block 4. This was an entirely different event to the three previous explosions. This explosion devastated the containment and no doubt ejected spent fuel fragments around the Fukushima nuclear complex, thereby rendering the radiological environment extremely hostile to the degree that access to the site overall remains radiologically challenging. Both of these events, the three reactor explosions and the fuel pond criticality incident, were very serious. Continuing emergency management is required on and around the Fukushima site. A very large number of people, upward of 200,000, have been evacuated and will remain evacuated from around the region. And there is a great uncertainty about the level of radioactive release to date, the potential for further release over the next few days and weeks, and with it, significant risk to the health and well-being of a very large urban population, stretching into the Tokyo conurbation of 35 million souls or thereabouts. What is known is just a few seconds of severe earthquake led to catastrophe or the catastrophic failure of 4 nuclear power plants, the contamination of the entire Fukushima nuclear complex, and as announced by the Japanese government, the abandonment of one of the world's largest nuclear power plant sites, of 6 nuclear power plants in all. At a very preliminary estimate, the cost of containing the nuclear plants and spent fuel, cleaning up the site, just the site, and replacing the lost 4.7 gigawatt of electricity generating capacity might be of the order of 40 to 50 billion euro. If the radioactive contamination has spread significantly beyond the Fukushima No. 1 complex, which seems to be the case, then the cost and health consequences could be very serious indeed. A number of signature fission products have been detected at 3 locations relatively remote from Fukushima. Of these, cesium-137 might have derived from either the reactor and or spent fuel explosions. The iodine-131 most likely was emitted during the reactor explosions, but as yet, and importantly, no significant actinides or fission products from the plutonium-based fuel of No. 3 reactor have been detected. Now, parliamentarians, allow me to examine the reason why the Japanese population is faced with what seems to be a very serious radiological calamity. I will argue that much of the same institutional failures apply to the Fukushima nuclear complex accident as those Soviet nuclear catastrophes that I touched upon earlier. If this premise is correct, then the question posed is surely how Japan, an acknowledged, highly sophisticated technological society, could have suffered the same institutional failings of the lumbering and then collapsing autocratic giant of the Soviets. I will present my opinion and strong belief that the Fukushima failures derive from a fundamentally flawed nuclear regulatory system as installed and practiced in Japan. Indeed, the nuclear safety regulatory system is international, adopting throughout much the same codes of practice, international approved radiation dose regimes, risk and hazard definitions, and assessment procedures. For example, we in Europe, like other regulators worldwide, adopt the same recommendation on dose limitation from the International Commission on Radiological Protection. The same International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, standards are adopted for seismic or earthquake loading, and we use the same American ASME engineering codes to determine the strength and resilience of nuclear reactor pressure vessels, be these for pressurized water, boiling water as at Fukushima, heavy water, moderated variants of the nuclear plants, and so on and so forth. Such is the consistency and universality of the nuclear safety regulatory regime that different national regulators are able to group together to exchange and strengthen this consistency of approach. For example, we in the European community have formed the European Nuclear Safety Regulators Group, comprising membership of all 27 European community states, irrespective of whether they individually generate electricity by nuclear power. This consistency of approach to nuclear safety means that a regulator, say from France, of Sûreté Nucléaire, could easily exchange places with a counterpart from the United Kingdom's Her Majesty's Nuclear Installations Inspectorate. Indeed, either of these two national nuclear regulators or another regulator drawn from any of the 16 states that operate nuclear power plants in the European community would feel perfectly comfortable swapping places with his or her counterpart in Japan. This brings me to the core issue of my intervention today. I will argue strongly, indeed I will assert, that what happened at the Fukushima No. 1 nuclear power station in Japan is not just the tragic and costly outcome of an engineering failure as a result of a malfunctioning piece of equipment or some generic feature of a boiling water reactor being overwhelmed in that particular locality at that particular time by earthquake and possible following tsunami. In other words, the Fukushima accident was a failure of the very regulatory system itself. It was an institutional failure. Moreover, because of the universality of the international nuclear safety regulator system, this failure of a nuclear system at Fukushima in Japan could equally, as chance would have it, be repeated elsewhere in the United States, in Britain, France, or indeed in any one of the 16 European community states that operate nuclear plants. As chance would have it, is the basis of the nuclear regulatory framework promoted and promulgated by the International Atomic Energy Agency, as to be subsumed by national codes. More fancifully, it is known as probabilistic risk analysis that forms the basis of the compact acceptable risk and tolerable consequences that determines whether the fault condition performance of a nuclear plant is acceptable. This compact works both ways. The risk of occurrence of an accident must be acceptable. It must not be unacceptably often, and if an accident does occur, then the radiological consequences must be tolerable. So more frequently occurring accidents and faults must be countered by enhancement of the resilience of the nuclear plant, say by extra safety systems or by more robust engineering of the containments. However, if the chance or risk of a severely damaging event is so remote, so infrequent as to be considered incredible, that it is most likely ever to occur, it logically follows, in the mind of the nuclear regulator at least, that there is no need to engineer into the plant any special countermeasures, strength, or additional safety system. As chance would have it, this means that the risk of an iceberg, representing but a tiny speck in a vast geographical space of the North Atlantic, colliding with an even smaller speck of a transatlantic liner, would be so remote, so infrequent as to be incredible. Hence, there would be no need to render the SS Titanic unsinkable or to equip it with lifeboats before it sailed on its ill-maiden voyage. So for the Fukushima Japanese regulator, he had to predict the risk of a severe earthquake striking the plant. He would have to foresee that the Fukushima complex, along with another 10 or so nuclear plants, would automatically shut down at the first tremor. And for this particular shallow epicentered earthquake, the individual plants would shut down virtually simultaneously. And this immediate loss of its power input would befuddle the Japanese electricity distribution grid to collapse, denying those same nuclear power plants essential electricity supplies to maintain cooling, and so on and so forth. And the spent fuel ponds, he would then have to ensure that the on-site emergency supplies, the diesel generators, would start and would not be overwhelmed by the tsunami that followed. Of course, in licensing Fukushima, the nuclear regulator in Japan, like his counterparts in the European community, would have followed through this then hypothetical cascade of events. He would have calculated the risk of occurrence of each element and its interaction with preceding and subsequent events to arrive at an overall probability or risk for that cascade running into completion. We now know, because Fukushima failed the acid test, that the Japanese regulator must have considered the earthquake tsunami cascade to have been an incredible event, so low in frequency of occurrence that both it and any special measures to safeguard the Fukushima plant could be ignored. Because the earthquake tsunami cascade was discounted on a probabilistic risk analysis alone, no plans were laid to respond to the inevitable failure of the 3 nuclear reactors and at least 1 spent nuclear fuel pond at the Fukushima nuclear complex. This absence of forward planning and preparation reflects in the expedient and mostly ad-lib post-accident control actions now being undertaken at Fukushima. The absurdity of helicopters water bombing the smoking hulks of 4 reactor buildings, the resort to riot control cannon being deployed at distance as the only means of cooling melting nuclear fuel. Senior manager of TEPCO publicly arguing with government officials, and the introduction of radiation dose controls at the threshold of acute exposure for those courageous workers now tackling the largely unknown and unplanned situation is, I put to you, a disturbing insight into the so obviously flawed nuclear safety culture based on as chance would have it alone. This endemic failing of the nuclear safety culture applies equally to the regulation of each one of the 143 nuclear power plants operated in the European community. There is no exemption because we're Europeans. The European Commission determined at the special meeting of the 15th of March that stress testing of the nuclear power plants will be sensible and prudent. But just what is meant by stress testing remains unclear. To my mind, and my resolute recommendation to you, is that it is absolutely essential that the European Commissioner implement immediate proactive action that is not confined only to reassessment of the European community's nuclear power plants, nuclear fuel and other facilities, but also carries through a fundamental root and branch examination of the same nuclear safety culture that we share and that has been a catastrophic failure in Japan. And one final point, who is to undertake this root and branch analysis of a flawed nuclear regulatory regime? Surely not the regulators themselves, for they have failed at Fukushima, and as chance would have it, they are vulnerable to failure here in the European community. And finally, I must say, parliamentarians, permit me to express my sympathy to the people of Japan in their suffering caused by this national calamity of earthquake and tsunami that has been so harsh on them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John. That was very clear and extremely interesting. We will have question and answers. I see members in the benches, but moving, but we will have question and answers after we also heard the Commissioner. But now we have one of the heroes from Chernobyl amongst us, and Mr. Yuri Andreev. His presentation will be in Russian. Interpretation is provided. And Mr. Andreev was the chief engineer on the turbine operation at the Chernobyl nuclear power station. And from 1990 until today, Yuri Andreev is the president of All Ukrainian Public Organization of Invalids, Union Chernobyl of Ukraine. Please.
Господин председатель.
Madam Chairman and ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to look at Fukushima through the prism of Chernobyl and the mistakes and alternatives. And this is a view of a chief engineer of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And I stepped in after 12 hours after the explosion at Chernobyl. The assessment of what's happened at Fukushima 1 is, well, this massive earthquake meant that 1, 2, and 3 were shut down. 4, 5, and 6 were under repair, but then there was the tsunami after only an hour, and within minutes, I would stress within minutes after that, the NPP lost its own electricity power. because of the swamping of the whole system with seawater, basically. So they were unable to control anything. I'm an energy engineer, and I've always worked on thermal and nuclear power plants, and I believe that the worst possible accident doesn't really exist in a way. Of course, at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, this was a 1,000 times greater release of radioactivity than Fukushima, and the period of the half-life of the fallout that came from the Chernobyl reactor was 1,000 times longer and is still going on, this fallout. So there was a release from the active core of the reactor, including uranium fuel. So tons of uranium fuel were released into the atmosphere around Chernobyl. But at the Chernobyl plant, the staff didn't lose control of the units. And although the accident spread to other units, we managed to localize the accident in that 1/4 block. After the loss of electricity to the cooling system, because of the spread of heat and the release, this led to the spread of the accident to units 1, 2, and 3. And the spent fuel rods heated up, and this occurred in Unit 4 as well. And particularly, it was particularly bad in the spent fuel ponds. And then there were explosions, very powerful explosions of hydrogen. So the 3rd and 4th units were partially destroyed, and the spent fuel ponds to some extent. Bearing in mind the inaccurate and possibly very partial information coming from the government of Japan, the power of the explosion was up to 4 million Röntgens an hour. And it could go up to as much as 30 milliröntgens an hour. And this is obviously extremely concerning. There was a release into the environment of noble gases, iodine and cesium and strontium, and one can assume that the release into the environment in total would have exceeded a few thousand curies. Now, that is what you can say now, because this is ongoing. At the Chernobyl plant, we had 150 million curies released into the environment, for comparison. The reaction at Fukushima 1 is this is a reactor of the 1st generation, which has various shortcomings. Even in on the 13th day after the tsunami, this accident is still ongoing, and particularly we're concerned about Unit 3, and indeed 1 and 2. On the 11th day at this nuclear power plant, the electricity was restored, but they still haven't managed to control the mechanism of the plant. Pilots of the helicopters refused to drop water, and the release at that time was about 4 Röntgens an hour. In Chernobyl, the helicopter pilots threw everything they could down there, sand and water, up to 500 Röntgens an hour. They were still throwing things down into the building. The firemen refused to work beyond 400 milliröntgens an hour, and yet in Chernobyl, they managed to put a roof over Chernobyl. There wasn't a fire ever, by the way, in Unit 4 in Chernobyl. That is a myth. This is probably a propagandist rumor that was spread. But what happened was different. There wasn't a fire. And the firemen who tried to, who went in there, found that there was no fire, but they nevertheless stayed, and the power there of release was about 200 million roentgens an hour. So it was something that you could not survive, basically. They were heroes. The government commission on Chernobyl, which had to draw the conclusions from this mess, is something that we need to apply to Japan. The first conclusion is that even when the fourth reaction, or the fourth unit went into meltdown, the government commission demanded that all means should be used to get water into that unit 4 for the next 3 days. Sorry, I'm being asked to speak more slowly because of the interpreter. If water had got into the plant, then the steam would have meant that the release from the core would have been enormous into the environment. And you have to understand that this is hundreds of millions of curies that would have been released if we'd put in water. And there would have been enormous explosions of various mixtures, as indeed is what happened in Fukushima. Thousands of cubic meters of water, which haven't actually fallen into the unit itself, would have encountered burst pipes and would have carried graphite reactive dust in the first, second, and third units beyond the fourth unit. And because of the heating in the cable galleries and a short circuit, we lost the reserve feed of the 6 kilowatt electricity feed to Unit 4, which at that time was still working at full capacity. On the 26th of April 1986, on about the 13th hour, the second unit was almost out of control. The unit had lost its reserve feed of the main circulation pumps. We had lost control, basically, over that unit. There was an instruction to shut the unit down, but that is not possible if there's no coolant. So we weren't able to shut down Unit 2. I participated in the attempt to shut it down, and we managed to do that without any meltdown. On the 12th hour, there was a government instruction to send in the helicopters, and they started throwing down sand, dolomite, lead, all onto Unit 2, and the aim of that operation was to stop access of the air to the core and stop a fire of the graphite and the graphite cask around the reactor. The conclusions for that, the consequences were that since the graphite didn't catch fire, the basalt meltdown didn't spill out of the reactor, and by using sand, we nevertheless caused graphite dust to rise into the atmosphere, and it was spread a very, very long way away from the reactor, and that's something that one should never do. And some of the lead bags fell into the central control room of Unit 3, just a few meters from the cover of the core of Unit 3 and the containment pond. So if those lead bags had fallen into the core itself, or the containment pond, we would have ended up with another nuclear accident. And it was just a miracle that those lead drops did not hit the cover. And there are about 100 tons there of oil, so there could have been an enormous ball of fire caused, which would have made it a very difficult situation to control indeed. At the beginning of May 1986, the Commission decided to provide liquid nitrogen above the reactor to try and cool the reactor in that way. And from all over the Soviet Union, they sent in dozens of tanks of liquid nitrogen. But it was good that they thought twice and they didn't actually implement that, because otherwise there could have been fatalities because of people suffocating through poisoning with this nitrogen. At the beginning of May as well, the Commission took a decision to use a kind of a core catcher under the reactor and put liquid nitrogen under the reactor. But before that work could be concluded, the reactor had started to calm down, as it were, but hundreds of miners nevertheless received massive doses of radiation. And they were doing a job which served no purpose in the end. Until the 10th of May, 1986, the Chernobyl plant, the staff were operating without any personal dosimeters. And they were supposed to only get 5 Röntgens per year. That's the annual dose. And yet in one single shift, we were getting many times the annual dose in exposure. We were given accumulators by the 10th of May for accumulators which were issued in the morning, and these were dosimeters basically, which were taken away in the evening. And even if you'd had 10 or more Röntgens in your shift, which is twice the annual allowance, when you got it back in the morning, it would say 0. And this was a ruse by the government commission, basically, because it looked as if the staff weren't being irradiated anymore in the Chernobyl plant. But the government commission still felt that this wasn't enough, and they thought up this system whereby the workers in the plant are, after all, professionals and should only be considered to be receiving their dose at the workplace, and any doses that they got during the transport to the plant should not be counted. And during that period, the main dose that we received, in fact, the main exposure was during transport to the plant, because that was where we were mostly being irradiated. So when members of the government commission and commentators and directors of institutes, Moscow institutes, make their reports, and they say that people who participated in the liquidation effort did not suffer from any real cancers, and they were just scared, and all their illnesses came from being afraid. All of this is nonsense. You could only be that ill basically by receiving massive doses of radiation. There was another terrible thing. The Minister of Energy, Majoritz of the Soviet Union, issued an instruction on the 3rd of May 1986 regarding the staff, saying that they should go into units 1 and 3 on the 10th and start up the plant again, those units, and the 4th unit even. Now, if they had actually started doing that, starting up the plants again, then all of the staff of the Chernobyl nuclear plant would have died. There was a decision by the government commission to forbid people being diagnosed as having radiation contamination. And radiation sickness is, under that instruction, was considered to just be the same as flu. A resolution of the Council of Ministers of the USSR on the liquidation of the consequences of Chernobyl said that 836,000 people should be sent into the plant to clean up, and this was really not necessary. That amount of people was not necessary. This was, and it meant that they were subject to radiation which was higher than the admissible standards, and it was all unnecessary. In our view, the IAEA, in its current form, is clearly unable to do its job. That's the first thing. The non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, and secondly, ensuring the safe use for peaceful purposes of nuclear energy. In the 20 years that we've just seen pass, the IAEA has analyzed the Chernobyl catastrophe, but this has led to a rather negligent attitude to accidents at nuclear power plants. Nobody has drawn the conclusions, really, from the Chernobyl catastrophe. Recommendations. The government of Japan should allow into the Fukushima plant international experts. We need to get a full picture of the power of the actual radiation and the exposure occurring in the zone and in the exclusion zone as well. We need to know what isotopes are being released, what their general activity is, what kind of radiation is being released into the atmosphere. One should not try and put water onto melted fuel. This will lead to further releases of radiation and explosions of hydrogen. In the plant itself, one has to carry out deactivation, release deactivation, and this can be done without major risks. This allows the staff to continue to work and other outside specialists, including firemen. There has to be a cooling system brought into units 1 and 2, which haven't yet melted down or gone into a melting situation, but this could still happen. With regard to the fuel masses which are in a melt situation in the cores of reactors 1, 2, and 3, and the spent fuel ponds and the units 3 and 4 containment areas, I think we need to try and stop this meltdown, which will require, I think, about 2 months. And after this, we need to ensure protection from releases and fallout for several years and try and reduce the active radiation. In sarcophaguses of the type of Chernobyl, you would only build such a sarcophagus above a containment area of spent nuclear fuel. In the first, second, and third units, that is not necessary. You just need to strengthen the existing confinement or to have some kind of solid box over the top of reinforced concrete, for example, to ensure there's no migration of radionuclides. All of this could be done through dropping sand and other types of soil. So that other measures can be taken. And this would take 3 or 4 years, these kind of measures, but at least then the territory would be clear of radionuclides. The building of the Ark, which is now going on in Chernobyl, this containment building, we feel is a complete waste of time. The Ark is not going to solve any problems. It's just a way of maintaining the problem which still exists in Chernobyl. Above all, this is a mass which contains fuel and active, radioactive spent fuel, which is still happening there, and this is really transuranic elements, which is very difficult with existing methods to reprocess. An alternative would be, if we took radical measures now, and I don't generally like radical measures because radical measures tend to throw up new problems which are just as radically dangerous as the problem that you were originally trying to solve. But if today we were able to restrict the radioactive release, this would mean that we would have to rely on coal-fired power stations. But the planetary catastrophe, the climate catastrophe, which is already causing major production problems in this planet, will increase. There are no other alternatives to the generation of electricity to nuclear power stations. We have to understand that nuclear power stations have major environmental problems. The biggest station, which is indeed in the Californian desert, the biggest plant of all, is already apparently releasing trace elements. And the effect of that is that people, even birds, for example, are dying in that area. We have to bear in mind, indeed, the enormous loss of territory if you were having solar arrays or other types of alternative energy. If you compare that with nuclear power plants, then you would lose an awful lot more territory in using renewables. You'd have to give up a quarter of your territory. And, of course, one has to look at the social consequences as well. Alternative energy is much dearer than conventional energy, and this means that for most of the population of this planet, the comforts of civilization will remain out of their reach, and this will lead to hunger and social consequences and possibly to revolution. So you have to think about the wisdom of alternative energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Andreev, and we have the deepest respect for your experiences and your knowledge in this area. Now, welcome, Commissioner. We've just heard from John Large, who has argued on security, explained what happened, and argued not only on stress test for the technology, but also for the security culture.
Regulator.
And regulator. Yes. And we also heard from Mr. Andreev, who is a former senior engineer at Chernobyl and who has looked at what happened from the points of the knowledge that we gained from the Chernobyl experience. And with this, I will give you the floor, and then I will ask Mr. Valeri and Mr. Andreev and also Mr. Large to have short comments on your intervention, and then I'll open the floor for questions from members. Thank you. Please, Commissioner.
Verehrter Herr Fraktionsvorsitzender Verhofstadt, Damen und Herren Abgeordnete.
Thank you very much, Mr. Verhofstadt, honourable members, ladies and gentlemen. Over the last 12 days, we have seen developments, the information, the pictures we have seen from Japan, which have very struck us. We, first of all, had to obviously have sympathy for the Japanese, but at the same time, we have respect for the calm and organised way the Japanese are tackling the tragedy, the tsunami, and the earthquake that have caused so many thousands of deaths. They are managing the situation, and the member states and the EU have offered help to the Japanese, technical assistance, humanitarian assistance, or other types of assistance from Europe if needed. At the moment, in the 6 blocks of this very large nuclear power plant, 2,700 megawatts, 4,700 megawatts is being generated, or when it's working, and the situation is stable at the moment. It's not heading towards meltdown, but the situation is not completely under control at the moment. Attempts are being made to provide light again, to provide emergency power supply, to repair cables, so that the cooling system can be set in motion again and prevent further overheating, to slow down the process, but it's not really successful at the moment, and the situation in and around the nuclear power plant has not changed. It's still not stable. It's still dangerous. There is a lot of activity still going on. There's the seawater, of course. There's atmospheric pollution. In Greater Tokyo, babies and small children, parents are being advised not to give their babies and small children tap water because of pollution, and the United States is no longer taking milk, dairy produce from Japan. So all of that shows that the process is still very far from being under control. What then are the lessons for the European Union to learn from this? What conclusions can we draw? We've had two conferences. One was on Monday this week, and the other was on Tuesday the previous week, and meetings of the Energy Council, which got in touch urgently with all member states, with the appropriate ministries, and with the businesses that have responsibility for nuclear power plants in the EU, and also manufacturers and repairers of nuclear power plants. And one thing is clear: the assessment of what has happened in Japan cannot be made for the time being. And there are very different points of view on the subject in member states, in Parliament, and indeed in the political groups within Parliament. As you all know, we have 14 member states which do have nuclear power plants and 13 that don't. In one country, Germany, we are pressing ahead faster than we had planned with nuclear power, but in Italy and Poland, they are thinking about giving it up. We have countries where there is a fundamental rejection of nuclear power, like Austria. Other countries do not have nuclear power of their own, but there are power plants in their immediate neighbourhood. Portugal and Luxembourg are examples. We have nuclear power plants that have been shut down because of accession in countries like Bulgaria, Slovakia and Latvia. And we have other of our neighbour states that have nuclear power plants, such as Switzerland, Ukraine and Russia. So we're all in a different position when it comes to being in favour of or against nuclear power. One thing, however, we have in common, and that is high safety, the highest possible safety standards, and should be European. That is the Commission's view. You can't fool with security. Even Austrians will agree on that, because, or Luxembourgers too, because they have nuclear power plants in their immediate vicinity. So safety is very important. Also in the new nuclear countries that have just started building nuclear power plants. In France, they're providing 18% of their electric power from nuclear plants. And there are many companies in the European Union and beyond who are involved. We've got a market leader, Areba, in the planning and construction of nuclear power plants. Safety is the lowest common denominator here. It's the one thing we all agree on. and that must be part of how we assess new risks and how we develop standards in the light of what has happened in Japan. 30% of our electric power in Europe comes from nuclear power plants. And I think that we should say, in all seriousness, that when we look at our energy roadmap for the next few years, nuclear power will be part of it. It will be part of our energy world over the next years, in the short term and in the medium and the long term as well. We've got to test, we've got to ensure we have higher standards, more safety, less risks. A nuclear power industry without any kind of risk is, of course, a pipe dream. We have to deal with the risks we can't get rid of, the residual risks. And then there's a question of how we can limit risk and when you reach the point where you can't afford to safeguard against risk because it's no longer profitable. So we need to look at stress tests. We need to read agreement on stress tests. Under the law as it stands, we have two legal bases in the European Union. For stress tests is not enough. One is the Euratom Treaty, and the other is dates from 2 years ago. It's the directive you voted on nuclear safety. 2 years ago, which had now to be written into the law of the member states. And it schedules that by 2014 the member states have to report formally on their nuclear safety authorities to the Commission. At the moment, this evaluation, this report, will now have to be on the agenda next year at the latest, not in 3 years' time, not in 2014. It's also clear that this directive is concerned only with formal responsibility. It's not, doesn't go into technical details of safety. You know, the size of a reactor, the thickness of the walls, the concrete, the emergency power supply, and so on. None of that has been settled. Can we do that in foreseeable time? We've got to implement that directive. At the moment, stress tests, safety checks, these are general criteria, general standards for testing, which may not be applicable across all nuclear power plants. We may have some special requirements in some cases. For example, some nuclear power plants are in places where there is seismic activity. In the Rhine, for example, we have a greater risk there than in other parts of Europe. So, you know, again, we're learning from what's happened in Japan. Flooding is also a problem along many rivers in Europe, the Danube, the Neckar, the Rhine. But it could also happen in other parts of Bordeaux and Great Britain. So these are natural factors, and they're very relevant. In addition to the technical factors, we've seen what happened in Japan. One question is power supply. How can you assure regular power supply plus backup power supply, emergency power supply, by means of decentralized power supply circuits? And of course, you've got to provide the sand, the ways of protecting against fire. The point is that you have to keep the cooling going, and you need the emergency power supply. You need the emergency power supply for that. That's the biggest danger, and that's what happened in Japan. So we need to have a stress test with shared standards, joint standards. We have to define that over the next 6 months. We need agreement among the member states on that. and the European Council tomorrow or the next day has got to give us a clear instructions there. In the Commission, as far as the Commission is concerned, this will have to be done by national authorities at the moment until such time as we have a European authority. Safety is indivisible. We need to also focus our interest on Switzerland, on Ukraine, on Russia too. It's also clear that unless we have a joint EU stress test in which all member states participate voluntarily, we will not be able to get people like Ukraine, Russia, Switzerland or Turkey to sign up. If we have member states that decide to join in and others that don't, well, why should Bern, Ankara, Moscow or Kiev, why should they join up if some of our member states aren't joining up? One last point, nuclear waste. Spent fuel rods, they're part of the problem. One of the problems in Japan is that one block had more than 200 tons of spent fuel rods being stored there in temporary storage. And now, of course, it's in the open air, and that's very, very dangerous indeed. So we need to speed up our European legislation so that member states are able to organise permanent storage of their spent nuclear fuel. There's a risk relating to, there is a risk for operating nuclear power plants from spent fuel being temporarily stored in them, and that's an unnecessary risk. Now, one point, one example. What about the possibility of an aeroplane hitting nuclear power plant? You've got to have nuclear power plants that can take a plane strike and remain stable. You could, of course, have terror strikes using aircraft as well. All of that's got to be planned in as well. Obviously, there are limits. You cannot have a deepen the concrete or thicken the concrete from 50 centimeters to 1 meter 50. But you've got to safeguard your citizens. There will always be residual risk related to nuclear power plants, and you can protect those against those risks, but you can't protect against every kind of accident that might occur. At the moment, I think that right across party boundaries in Parliament and in all member states, we are all agreed that we need common European safety standards. We need to assess what we need together. Then we need to have a stress test organised and carried out by specialists. And that will give us the maximum amount of common conclusions that we can draw. Thank you.
Personally, I think that ordinary people would have imagined that stress tests were built into the system since decades. But I will allow very short questions from the panel. You could come back to analysis after that, and then from the floor. And we have 3 members already asking for the floor. It's Chatzimarkakis, Lepage, Davis and Hall. And yes, everybody. Okay, so and we have translation till 12:40. So keep it short. This is no time for declarations on personal views. This is question and answers. Mr. Andreev, do you have a question to the Commissioner?
No, I thought it was very complete, what he said. I thought it was very thorough.
Thank you. Mr. Lange?
Well, I don't have any questions. I would actually like to express my astonishment, actually, of some of the statements you've made. And I rather like, actually, sitting comfortably back and have yourself, a lawyer, tell me, an engineer, how to strengthen nuclear power plants, how you can make those crash-worthy, how you can increase the containment concrete from 50 millimeters thick to 1.5 millimeters thick. This is a very complex piece of technology. I just want to pick up one or two points. You talked about future years and the European Commission doing something in future years. The nuclear power plants that we have now in the European community have a life, an existing life, that will take us at least 2 to 3 decades into the future. Their decommissioning periods may well be 100 years or more after that. So we have a significant radiological risk situation in the European Union. These hazardous plants will stay in place for 100 and more years, the present ones. And you talk about directives. The directives will solve all. Some of these plants were designed before the European Union was brought into position, before we thought we could cure engineering, containment, safety, terrorist attack situations, before the word directive was actually taken into the minds of engineers designing these plants. And stress test. What do you mean by stress test? Is this a convenient phrase? Does it mean that the regulatory system itself will be examined? Does it mean the regulators will be called for account? You know, the UK Secretary of State, Hune, has determined that the Chief Inspector of the Nuclear Installations Inspector, our safety regulator in the UK, will determine our stress test. And he's left it entirely to the Chief Inspector to determine the terms of reference. Now, it's hardly likely that that regulator will self-examine itself. And then finally, fuel, spent fuel. Many of the reactors in Europe have a dilemma over spent fuel. I can say, for example, in the UK, the Magnox reactors, that's the first generation of nuclear reactors in the UK, they've now been mostly decommissioned, but still stay there with fuel stocks in their reactors. For example, Dungeness Power Station, the nearest one to France, that power station in Kent has about 500 tons of spent fuel in its reactors, decommissioned reactors, and about 300 tons in its spent fuel ponds. And of course, what is to say that the fuel reprocessing plants like Kojima in France at Le Havre and Sellafield, which have thousands upon thousands of tons of spent fuel in situ, are any safer and have thought out the dilemma that's likely to face nuclear power plants from terrorism, etc., than the nuclear power plants themselves. So those are my statements rather than questions.
Thank you. Hans van Baalen, who is the chairman of the European Parliament Delegation for Relations with Japan.
A very short intervention, Lena. As an EP Japan delegation, we directly contacted our counterparts in Japan. We paid respect, of course, to the Japanese, but we made also a very important point, is that we have to learn from this disaster what went wrong, and we have to have total transparency. So this is not a national disaster, this is a disaster with international implications, so one cannot be silent and say this is our matter. Prime Minister Kan, as health minister years ago, was the first to bring health problems in the open. So we hope that he will do the same and share all the information with the international community, especially also the fact that the International Atomic Energy Agency has brought warnings to Japan. And there was no reactions, warnings on the safety of the power plant, etc., some years ago. So transparency is the key issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Chatzimarkakis.
Thank you very much for organizing this event. And first, I have a question to Mr. Large. You talked about the institutional failure which was to be observed in Japan, and you called for a strengthening of the international consistency. Now, I ask myself, how are the standards in Russia, China, India, building up new power plants nearly every day? How many of them are in earthquake zones? And do you believe it's realistic to go for an UN ban on power plants in earthquake zones. Switch to German. Herr Kommissar Oettinger, ich begrüße Ihre rasche Initiative. Ich habe die Intervention von Herrn Large mir angehört, verstehe ich auch aus der
Well, I do understand from the point of view of, from an engineering point of view, what you said, but I think from a political point of view, it's excellent that we've reacted so quickly. There's 2 points that you have highlighted. One is safety competence of the EU and obligatory stress tests. You talked about voluntary stress tests, but what about binding, obligatory stress tests? How quickly can we set those up? Because if they're not going to be obligatory, and if we don't get EU level nuclear safety competence, then we're not going to get very far. So there's the Energy Minister Council on Monday. So what is your assessment of what happened there? From what the media has told us, it wasn't very encouraging. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Well, Commissioner, personally speaking, I fully support your rapid initiative, but it would seem that it's going to run up into major difficulties. And as Mr. Large has said, and I thank him very much for his presentation, I think that there's a real lack of an overall safety concept, generally speaking. And it's this lack right from the start, which has been shown so wanting when these extreme phenomena have occurred. In France, we had an abnormal episode in the south of France in the Vendée last year, and we're experiencing extreme weather situations such as floods, and also we're experiencing earthquakes. And our nuclear power stations were not really designed with those in mind. Those power stations are 20, 30-year-old, and they were just not designed for some of the events that are happening. And as Mr. Large has said, this is going to put us in extreme difficulties, because the investments which we would need to do in order to guarantee the safety of these nuclear power plants are going to be absolutely enormous. And so I think we need to think about how we should rethink our energy mix in the future, and how we can work on the renewables sector to compensate for that.
Chris Davis, have the floor.
Well, I accept the need for regulatory bodies to start taking into account worst-case scenarios, but I just don't know where the limit is to be drawn, and I'd like the views of the panel. If we have to start taking into account the idea that, and the very real possibility, that at some point a terrorist will hijack a 747 and drive it into a nuclear plant at 600 miles an hour, I don't know how you build something that can survive that sort of impact. And it's not just the reactor; it's the storage area, as has been said. That has to be protected. In my constituency at Sellafield, we've got 80 tons of plutonium. I mean, I'm not sure what that would survive. More than 80 tons. It was 71 tons when I was last there. It was probably 90 or more now. Over 105 tons of plutonium. I mean, that wouldn't. I doubt if that would survive a light aircraft smash rather than a 747. I mean, but where do you draw the line? And also, what about, where do you draw the line with other matters? Look at the chemicals industry, for example. What happens if a 747 drives into a chemical plant and releases God knows what into the atmosphere? Do we have to protect everything? I mean, how do you do? I don't know how these questions are answered, but there has to be a line drawn in the sand between what is acceptable and what is not.
Fiona Hall.
Thank you. I was wondering whether the panelists accept the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency's description of the crisis as having been caused by the loss of power, which caused the loss of cooling, rather than by the earthquake itself. And whether the panelists therefore are concerned, given that with climate change we have an increasing number of natural disasters and extreme weather events, and that means in fact that we are not safe in Europe because we have less earthquakes, but in fact are as equally vulnerable to this sort of extreme event. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Panayotov.
Thank you. Thank you, Lena. Thank you for the masculinity to organize a conference like that, and thank you for inviting those experts. They painted an objective picture Just one question. There are member states that want to build new nuclear power plants. Taking into account all the risks, the spent fuel and the risks of natural disasters, do you believe that we will be able to have enough energy until in the future we get the new sources? Thank you.
I wonder if you're also intending to look into the public procurement for safety components in nuclear plants. While there were reports in media about, well, not exactly or exactly wrongdoing in public procurements, and this might constitute a risk also. So I don't know if the Commission has an instrument to look into this.
Thank you very much. I think these are, of course, extremely important questions, and I guess we will have extremely important answers from the Commission.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think we need to make sure that we take a sober analysis of what conclusions can be drawn and what possibilities are there to act. Renewables, firstly, yes, we're on the right road there. 20% renewable energy targets to be achieved by in 9 years' time, and we need to have 10% renewables in transport, and when it comes to energy production, electricity production needs to be 35% renewables. That is the EU target. 35% of electricity in the EU needs to be produced by renewables by 2020. That means that renewable energies are going to overtake nuclear energy in 4 years' time at 30%, and by 7% it's going to take over lignite and other fuel. And the energy roadmap is not just going to talk about 2015, but also 2020 and 2025. Now we need to look at the question of whether in energy production we can move up from 35% up to maybe 50% generation through renewables. If you want to go up to that level, then member states such as France, where 80% of electricity comes from nuclear, they're going to have to ask the question of whether they're going to accept binding rules and targets. Because if you want to get up to more than 40% electricity from renewables, it's going to be very difficult for countries like France to make that transition, because no one's going to need 120% electricity production in a transitional phase. So we are going to need to think carefully about that. Secondly, if you analyze the catastrophe in Japan, and I'm sure that the experts will know more in a few weeks' time than they do now, but the earthquake was what triggered it. But that isn't the only cause. The tsunami was the second factor. What is right is that the damage really occurred when the cooling system stopped, because the electricity stopped. And when the electricity cut out because there weren't enough emergency generators working, it would seem. And so one might have to ask the question about beefing up the provision of emergency electricity for nuclear power stations. That's a question we need to address for our nuclear power stations. It's not just about currently existing nuclear power stations. In the years to come, new power stations are probably going to be built in Europe. And so when we are analysing and evaluating new nuclear power stations, we need to look at new safety features which can be included and which are feasible and affordable. For example, having higher protection against floods, or siting power stations in areas which are not prone to earthquakes. And so we're looking into the planning of new nuclear power stations. Switzerland are planning 2 new stations. There's also Kaliningrad, and in Turkey as well, just a few kilometers from Greece and Bulgaria. There are power stations being planned there too. The question is, can you avoid an increase a multiplication of risk in the future by taking best practices on board. I see my task as being to present in full transparency what the dangers are, the risks are for currently existing nuclear power stations. For example, power stations which are in areas which have had 5 or 6 Richter scale earthquakes in the last 20 or 30 years, or nuclear power stations which are above flight paths. And if there's something we can do to protect them that's technically feasible and affordable, then we should do it. And if not, we should accept the risks. That's going to be a political discussion we're going to have. We need consultation and decision-making when we know more than we do today. And the first task of the stress test is to make us all know more than we know today, because 14 member states out of the 27 have nuclear power, and there are very different construction rules, retrofitting rules, lifespans. Let me take Germany, for example, and France. You have the River Rhine, and on the Rhine there are, on the eastern side, power stations. Strasbourg, for example, just above it there's a power station, just below it there's a power station. Philipsheim, just 20 or 30 kilometers away from Strasbourg. And if you're going to carry out stress tests and have common shared EU rules, well, you can't have differing rules for the future standards of nuclear power stations just 20 or 30 kilometers apart. It's very important, I think, for us to have commonly agreed standards in our shared European home. Now, I think at the moment we can only carry out voluntary stress tests, but I think that it's in all of our interests for all of the member states to take part, because it's in their economic interests and also in their public health interests. And so I think that member states are going to be stakeholders in this process, and the original member states, which regarded this with a certain amount of suspicion, such as France, the United Kingdom and Italy, are increasingly getting involved in the process and showing willing to get involved. And if everybody gets involved, well, then we can also include Switzerland and Ukraine. I spoke yesterday at length with Mr. Boyko, and he is interested in Ukraine getting involved with their nuclear power stations in these stress tests, but only if all EU member states take part in the stress tests. If we're not going to be one united team in Europe, then the others aren't going to want to take part either.
Thank you, Commissioner. Just one follow-up question from myself. The standards that are used are international. In putting in place EU standards would mean also that you question the institutional framework and the safety culture of what is in place. So how do you foresee the institutional framework in the future to take care of EU common standards?
Die Frage können...
Well, experienced Europeans can answer that better than I can, but I would say that if the voluntary stress test is a success, which everyone participates in, then on that basis, member states would be prepared to look at a Commission proposal for an early renewal of the Nuclear Energy Safety Directive. In other words, based on the practicalities of what exists on the ground, then perhaps they might agree to an institutionalization, legalization, as it were, of the energy safety principles, and not just basic principles about having regulatory authorities, but also the actual nitty-gritty, the content of these directives.
I'll also ask you about the time frame. The directive, safety directive, will be implemented 2014. Is now March 2011. So what's the time frame, as you see it, for the different?
Die Direktive muss...
The directive must have been transposed by July this year into national law. And then 2014 would be the next date. The evaluation would occur next year. And then we would draw the conclusions, of course, from Japan and integrate the results of our stress tests.
A couple of years. But there are member states that doesn't have no-fly zones over reactors right now. Do you think a couple of years is enough?
Zurück an die Frage.
Well, I'd like to deal with that question over the next few weeks with you, really, with the help of member states. As the Commission makes progress, and if member states don't have any trust in the process, then they will not play ball. I mean, look at France. There is a concern in France that Brussels may be too hasty, and that's a fear greater in France than in Austria. So we have to take everybody with us on this. There are so many parliaments as well. And it depends as to which party is the majority in each parliament as to whether they're pro-nuclear or not. And we need to take with us all member states and have their trust, because otherwise we will damage the whole enterprise.
There were also questions to the rest of the panel. Do you want to answer them, or do you?
Can we do that?
Yes.
Could I say that how strongly I disagree with the Commissioner on this? You know, look, it is not about directive. It's not about union consistency. It's about nuclear safety, and it's about public perception of nuclear safety. You may well be able to standardize something in Europe, and it may be successful. But what you've got to understand about nuclear regulatory control is that it's an interrogatory process between the operator, the designer, and the Nuclear Safety Authority. And the Nuclear Safety Authority simply examines the safety case that is put up by the operator in conjunction with the designer. So, for example, in France, for this new generation of nuclear reactors, the EPR, the European Pressurized Reactor, the French firm AREVA, they say that the worst case accident, again, as chance would have it, the worst conceivable accident to that system would not lead to a release of radioactivity that's greater than 0.03% of the reactor core per day. I'll say it again, 0.03%. Now, if we take Yuri's accident in Chernobyl, 6 days the accident took place over, generally agree between 30 and 60% of the transuranic, the fission products of that core got out into the atmosphere. 60%, 36%. For a worst-case reactor accident, including terrorist attack, for the EPR design, AREVA claimed that the maximum release, possible release, in all credible accidents, again, including terrorist attack and aircraft, would not exceed 0.18%, less than 0.1% of the release of the core, whereas we've seen in Chernobyl 30 to 60%, we've seen elsewhere now in Japan, maybe up to 10% of the cores coming out. And the other thing is, if you determine a consistency across the European community, first of all, you have to account for all the plants that were built 30 to 40 years ago. They were designed in the 50s and 60s. And moreover, you have to account for countries like Iran, who had plants being built, a plant being built at Bushehr on the Gulf. That Iran, you have the Emirates introducing Korean plants. You, as a community, cannot actually impose a nuclear standard upon those countries. Those countries are actually hiring nuclear standard regulators from here, there, and everywhere. And the real problem is this. If you take the European community's approach to Iran, for example, there on one hand, you're actually sanctioning, embargoing Iran on nuclear technology. You're denying Iran nuclear technology, which, okay, may well slow down its march towards nuclear weapons, but it will certainly halt in its tracks its understanding of nuclear technology for civil nuclear reactors. So we've compromised ourselves by putting a political embargo on one country and then encourage them through the IAEA to actually produce nuclear power. What the Iranians would want to do would be to kick the Russians out, the technicians out, and run that Bushehr plant themselves. If they did that, they'd have all the embargoes on and be running the largest source of radioactivity in the Gulf. I want to say one more thing, if I may.
Very short.
You mentioned aircraft crash. Aircraft crash, Sellafield, my favourite holiday place. You know, look, accidents are accidental by their nature. Accidents are unintelligent, unintentional events. A terrorist attack, an aircraft, is an intentional, intelligent attack that seeks out the vulnerabilities of our plants, our nuclear plants. The present generation and the existing new generation of nuclear plants, including fuel plants, front and back-end fuel plants, do not take into account terrorist attack. In the UK, our only safeguard against them is knowing, so we suppose, what the terrorists will do next, how we plan. We have no physical safeguards against terrorism. And in fact, our advanced gas-cooled reactors have, as a recent report came out, have no resistance against aircraft crash from a 737A319. They will have a significant radiological release. So we have to sit back and think about the way in which we've actually arranged our nuclear safety, how we satisfy public perception of all things radioactive to be a fate worse than death. That's the most important thing, is to educate the public and take the public along with you. Therefore, the public can, if you have a compact of acceptable risk and tolerable consequences, at least the public will understand what risk they're being asked to accept and what consequences they'll have to bear. That's it.
Thank you. That was, I think, a nice closure of this seminar. I would like to thank the Secretariat who organized, and I would like also to say to Mr. Valery Makarenko and to Mr. Yuri Andreev, a very heartfelt thank you for coming here and bringing your knowledge and experience, and we've learned a lot. We certainly will come back to the lessons you've learned in your work in Chernobyl, and all the MEPs here has listened to your experiences with the deepest respect. Thank you very much, and thank you, John Large, for bringing your knowledge to this panel. And I must say, finally, that a thank to the Commissioner Oettinger, who went out from a meeting with the Commission to be with us and discuss this, and he had to rush back because there were items on the agenda that were important for him. So I think it was very nice of him to take the time to come here. And thank you to all of you. And the meeting is closed.